relationship that you said. He doesn't have a lot of people that he's in contact with.
Okay.
So
It felt really good to have healed and now be experiencing just the
don't
joy.
have any kids, we don't have it, like you and society.
Yeah.
No kids, no real family.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone for being here today. I'm going to start by asking you about your relationship with Gurminder. I'm really curious to know when you first met her.
Who goes first?
Who wants to go first?
Shall I go first? Well, I met Gurminder at the same time as Saeed Adris, who's with us. I was living as an artist and working in Leicester in the Midlands, having been a community photographer in Coventry and then working, doing photography mainly in Leicester. But I was very interested, I was working on a show with Claudette Holmes in Birmingham, entitled Womaness, and we were producing that around 1990. So I was making contact with what I would consider to be really significant women who are bringing about change and thinking about, in all kinds of ways, thinking about their presence, if you like. So Womaness was a show that both the two of us did together in 1990. That was in the Wolverhampton Art Gallery. That's where it began. And I did portraits of women. And Gurminder was somebody who gracefully agreed to have her portrait taken. And I was doing this combination of text and imagery in the darkroom, so superimposing text onto the images. And we spent a couple of days together in her studio doing it. It was black and white, pre-digital, and doing a medium format portraits of her. And the thing that struck me about her was her self-image transferred into the paintings that she did. And she happened to have these wonderful large paintings that, and she reproduces her eyes substantially in these paintings. You could see them all over. And it was just amazing to compose the image with her, to have a discussion with her and compose it in keeping, ensuring that her paintings were part and parcel of the composition. So it was a really beautiful time, and I really was grateful to her for doing that. And she also suggested in our conversations, she suggested, and I used a quote from Sajat Baharat, who lived in Germany but had written a very beautiful poem, and I used an extract of that. That was talking about the Himalayas, actually, in India. So there was something quite interesting that I found really engaging with her work in relation to ecology. And so for me, she's a woman after my own heart, of thinking about women's presence and their relationship to ecological issues and spaces. So I can stop there. I don't want to take up too much.
And I think, Bhajan, you also met Gurminder in 1990 as well, is that right?
That's right. I actually knew of Gurminder before I met her.
Right.
Because her work was in Let the Canvas Come to Life with Dark Faces, which was curated by Eddie Chambers. So I knew of her, and I think, like Roshini says, we knew of lots of artists of color around that time who were working in different spaces without having met them. And then later on, I met Gurminder through Saeed and got to know of some of the work that they had been doing in Nottingham and in East Midlands. And then I actually spent time with Gurminder when we were both invited by Rubindra and Amrit, the Singh twins, to participate in an exhibition in Birkenhead. And we actually...
And that was maybe a decade later?
That's right, yeah. So I visited her then, because we were around that time living partly in Nottingham. And so we visited her and we thought about the work that we were going to put together. And they were interested in works on paper. So I had my prints and Gurminder had her watercolors on paper. So that's the time when I actually got to know her and how Gurminder actually worked in her quiet, serene way without kind of overtly talking about her practice and her work. And the commitment to her practice, really. So we put the work together, and around that time the exhibition was almost for a month or so. We spent a couple of days together putting the show up and meeting up with the Singh twins, and then later on during the private view and then collection of the work. But then later on also, while we were in Nottingham, we met up with her during one or two private views that were happening at what was the Apna Arts around that time, which then later on, maybe Syed will fill us later on, which became the New Arts Exchange. So there was a lot more work happening in Nottingham around that time, which was at grassroots level. And of course, we were always looking for opportunities to exhibit. And I think the regional arts gallery, like the Herbert Art Gallery or the Leicester City Gallery, they were much more instrumental in promoting work of generally Black British artists. But when I say Black British artists, I think it covered not only, it was South Asian artists along with African, Caribbean artists. So it was a much more kind of broader group of people, especially if you look at Let the Canvas Comes to Life with Dark Faces and what the exhibition that Eddie had curated, we were looking at, which were artists from different backgrounds, but for a collective struggle as such.
Let's go into that in a bit more detail. I think that given that the paintings in the exhibition, which are reproduced in the book that's just come out, are very specifically focused on the work that Gurminder was making in the late 1980s going into the early 1990s. And that transition geographically was really important for her. When she moved to Nottingham in 1983, she became involved in the East Midlands Arts. And I wondered if you had memories of that organisation, and you were just talking about how the Midlands were obviously a very important place for exhibitions, for artists to be taking place, for Indian, Caribbean, African artists. Did you have any personal involvement with East Midlands Arts?
I did. I was on the board and then on some advisory committees over the years.
Yeah.
And then I was also at West Midlands Arts later on. But yeah, I mean, I think, we were putting pressure on them to do things, right? So we need to be clear about that there was a discussion.
Was this connected to the Midland Group in Nottingham?
No, you're talking about the East Midlands Arts, which used to be part of the Arts Council, so it's a sub.
Okay, can you explain a bit about what that was and what they were doing?
Right. So in effect, there were regional offices of the Arts Council, and there was East Midlands Arts kind of covered Leicester, Nottingham, etc., the big cities, as well as smaller regions. And in effect, they devolved money and managed and supported artists at a more local level, I think. So one of the things they ended up doing as a result of having discussions with the Arts Council and things like Autograph and Innova being around nationally was, really looking out for levels of support to local artists of colour, really, in a way. And as Bhajan has said, it's that really that net was opened up in terms of where people were from which diaspora. So it was a bit of pressure that we put on them, and they were quite progressive in terms of really wanting to engage and recognise that actually the population in somewhere like East Midlands or West Midlands, Birmingham area is, it completely multicultural, and they need it. And in fact, Leicester's the first city that has a majority population of Asian origin. So you've got this incredible kind of lack of recognition that was happening prior to the early 80s. And I met Gurminder in 89 actually, because I was photographing her then. But it was a time of really just putting pressure on them to respond and to take account of local populations really, and local artists, and giving support.
So you moved from that kind of regional level of exhibition to a couple of shows that I want to just point out. The first was in 1988, The Essential Black Art, curated by Rashida Rian at Chisenhale in London. The following year, he then curated The Other Story at the Hayward. And in 1988, there was, of course, Black Art Plotting the Course, curated by Eddie Chambers. And Gurminder was included in that exhibition, which is now considered, and was considered at the time, as a really pivotal show. So it felt as though things were moving, even though that show wasn't in London, but it felt like it was a touring exhibition that went around Manchester, Wolverhampton, Liverpool, and I think really developed a consciousness amongst artists themselves about what they were part of. Would you agree with that?
I think that there were different things happening around the country. I mean, I can recall, and Eddie was instrumental in some of the regional exhibitions that happened outside London, including Plotting the Course, but also you had in the early 90s. I mean, if you think about The Other Story, which happened around...
It was 89.
89.
Yeah.
There were shows like In Focus, which were curated at the Horizon Gallery as a kind of a reaction to some of the artists who had been kind of left out, mostly South Asian women artists. None of their presence was in The Other Story, which is interesting. But then you also had shows, I mean, I myself had one-person shows around that time, 94 and 95 at the Horizon Gallery and the Aspects Gallery in Portsmouth. But then we had the Savaf Festival, which was the South Asian Visual Arts Festival in Birmingham Art Galleries, which actually included lots of artists. I'm not sure whether Gurminder was part of it, but we've got Nilofer Ahmed here. I think she was part of the show. And also you had Cartwright Hall, and we had Nima Purva Smith, who was the only art gallery that actually was purchasing and commissioning South Asian artists around that time. So there were like things happening in different places, but I must say that the regions were much more open to exhibiting works of artists of color, rather than, London was, I think, still quite a difficult place to penetrate. And then you had, of course, you had the Black Art Gallery and the Horizon Gallery that were particularly looking at Black artists exhibitions or work of Black artists produced. So there were different, almost like, satellite, different shows cropping up. And of course you had Crossing Blackwaters exhibition, which was curated by Panchayat in
Leicester, City Art.
That's early 90s at City Gallery Leicester, and then which went on to Oldham Art Gallery. So so the regions were much more, whether, as Roshini says, I think there was much more pressure on the Arts Council. And the Arts Council at that time, we must also remember, was represented in different regions, not like now where it's kind of much more centralized. And then you had the Southern Arts and the East Midlands Arts and West Midlands Arts and different regions really.
And I just wanted to add to that I think there was also, there's obviously you're referring to a kind of visual arts gallery space of fine art.
Well, I wanted to ask you about autograph.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that was happening also was these kind of parallel but also connected discussions, both in film, video, you know, the film video workshops were around, and also autograph, of course. So those conversations were having across media, if you like, as well as kind of across different diasporic groups as well, which was a really exciting time in a way.
I think when plotting the course, particularly having looked at the catalogue, I think what that exhibition and the exhibition curated by Rashid had presented was the idea of this British Black Arts movement, where, as you were saying, there's a lack of distinction between where an artist's heritage is. So it doesn't matter whether your parents are from India, Africa, Caribbean. The idea was that black art was something that was essentially a form of political resistance. Do you think that Gurminder's work, or the way that she was talking or thinking about her work at that time, was reflective of that?
I think it's quite interesting because Addie Chambers had Gurminder's work on the cover of Plotting the Course,
Yes, that's right.
which I think in itself is quite interesting.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So he was really alluding to that, wasn't he?
I mean, the reason I mention that also is because as early as '84, after Gurminder had just moved to Nottingham, she, helps to find the Asian Artists Group, which suggests to me that she's very much focused on wanting to belong to that heritage and finding that interesting in terms of the work that she's making.
I must say, shall I?
Go for it.
Yeah, well, I think we were looking for opportunities to exhibit. Remember, we'd all come out of art schools, there was a lot of energy, there was we were looking out for collaborations, we were looking out for partnerships. So I think those were those were the avenues which were open to us. There was very little for us, I think, in terms of mainstream galleries. So those collaborations, those kind of collective partnerships were important because we wanted our work to develop, we wanted our work to be looked at, and for it to be out there within reputable regional spaces where it could be seen. I think that was really important, and I don't think that particular decisions were made as to belong to anything. I think whatever opportunities we got at the time, we jumped on them. And I think one other name that comes to mind, which is quite important, was Maud Salter around that time, because I actually met up with artists like Claudette, Ingrid Pollard, Nina Edge around that time because of some of the collective workshops which Maud put together, and she was working towards Passion, her publication around that time. So I think different people in different parts of the country were in their own ways trying to make things happen. If you think about Eddie, he was based in Bristol at the time, and Maud had come from Glasgow. And of course, things were happening in the Midlands, and they were happening in southern region as well. We had things happening at John Hansard Gallery. So whether they were women's shows, whether they were collective shows in some capacity, but I think it was quite important. I think the collective energy was really important at the time, that boosted artists' work.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that it was a precarious collective notion, right? So there was something, it was quite loose, and it was in solidarity, but it was also, as Stuart Hall talks about, there's deep significant differences, right? People's histories, particular histories and narratives, were being subsumed into this term blackness, and I think that there was tension and difficulties with that happening at all times. So for me, when we started to see somebody like Sunil doing Fabled Territories show, for example, or the Asian artist group in Nottingham, it's suggesting there's a kind of a distinctiveness that needs to be attended to for that kind of cultural specificity at a moment, but it's still actually connected to a wider discourse around a collective kind of mobilizing and wanting to change, how we get into universities, how we're actually getting access to galleries and stuff. So it was not a kind of easy plain sailing in any sense of the word. And for me, Gurminder's work was quietly kind of doing her own thing from a very particular deep-rooted spiritual space of northern India, and that had a danger of being subsumed, of being able to read that kind of depth and knowledge and research that she was doing in the collective black issue, right? So and Slade might say more about this, I think, but it seems to me that at certain moments it was important to also dig deep around cultural specificity, and that was quite important. So and then of course it started to fracture. So that was due to all kinds of circumstances, I would suggest as well, needless to say, our political space as well.
So is it really a case that something like Plotting the Course was a massive platform for artists to be read in a way that was essentially generic? They were just all put, that's crude, but they were essentially given an opportunity because of their background, because they weren't being given opportunities elsewhere, and they were acknowledged for the quality of their work. But it wasn't really until later on in other exhibitions that people really started to read the work on a personal level in a way that they would an artist who was, not that.
Let's be clear that the curation of those big shows were really important and really sensitively done, and in recognition of all of the richness of those works. There isn't any question about that. So, but I think the idea of the collective blackness that was being kind of used as a shorthand by the Arts Council in a way, and it's a bit like decolonialism at this point in time in university. There is a kind of a way in which our host nation responds to a kind of an easier, more generic kind of way in which they recognize us. And I think we have always been trying to maintain a more complex relationship. And that, so at a certain moment, it was really important to talk about presence and visibility. And then I think the idea and the uncovering of a more complex history and relationship to the UK becomes quite important and is shown through the work, it seems to me.
Well, let's talk a bit about how Gurminder's paintings develop in quite a critical period, which this exhibition really documents. The works that she was making in the late 1980s, I think the earliest work in this show is 87, I think. And she's really drawing on Hindu symbolism. Goddess Kali is someone who is very present in her work. I think that relates a lot to her interests in feminist endeavors, which we can talk a bit about later. But there's definitely a shift from the kind of iconography that she is using to developing this style that it becomes very sparse, it becomes surreal, I would say, and she really develops her language and sticks to that language. So I just wonder if there's anything to be said there about how she was referring to her Indian folk art interests, and then expanding on those interests to create something that becomes very abstract, I think.
Do you want to say something? I would just say that what really struck me was, because one of the things that is also quite clear is the minute we start talking to each other about where our background is, where we've come from, and the different generations, it's really quite complicated, right? So for me, Gurminder, and I remember having conversations with her about her memory of India, of northern India,
And just to make sure that everyone knows that Gurminder spent the first 10 years of her life in India,
right.
and then moved to Wales, actually.
And we had conversations about, because I was born in England but then returned to the Caribbean and spent my formative years there. And equally so, like Tate as well, have different kind of relationships to our knowledge of the UK and our memories of the places that our families are from. So for me, Gurminder really is recalling a kind of a memory that to me is less familiar, because I'm not familiar. I sort of know about Kali through Guyana, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to Kali my pujas, but this is a very, very different thing that she does here. There is a very real way in which it seems to me that they are particularly recalling a kind of a space of India quite distinctly. And that changes, to me, just looking at her later pieces, there's some really interesting ways in which this becomes more abstract, and there's a more muscular form in a way of the woman. So there's a kind of an adamant statement that she makes through the portraits, which I really, really enjoyed.
And I think that's a really important point, because a lot of these works are self-portraits. So it's about her being in the painting.
Yeah.
And you were saying this about your experience of working with her on the photographs, and like this idea of her being very aware of herself in the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I find is, I think we were all looking at some kind of an empowerment. And one thing which we did have is our heritage, and something which we knew that that was something which nobody could take away from us, because I think there were a lot of struggles on the outside, whether even in art schools and our day-to-day existence, where we were trying to bring to life or trying to make things visible, which were very much our inner strengths. And I think that is what I find really striking about Gurminder's work, whether she's looking at the idea of fertility, whether she's looking at and also the visibility of the nude, and not feeling contrived about that. And also the kind of movements like the Chipko movement, which existed in India. And I know we've sort of mentioned 1970s, but the Chipko movement actually goes much more...
19th century. It's very old.
That. And, Amrita Devi, who was killed as a result of that and as a martyr through that movement. So I think some of those, I feel that Gurminder is actually exploring those strengths through her work. But she's also using body parts like the hair and the eyes, and somehow, bringing sort of almost comfort to that, within that. And obviously there are a lot of those biographical stories which we can kind of see in the work, whether in the earlier work, whether she's using the decorative elements and then they disappear with just the bodies. But what I find there was one thing, was the kind of nature of the colors and the technique that Gurminder used, which stayed stable throughout her practice. So I think in her own way, she was like really trying to bring forth that energy force, whether it was through Kali or through some of the other stories of Indian mythology.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is about her really having identified her language and being confident at working in that way and feeling content at having found that visual language as well. she talks about influences, and I think so much has been said about her interest in Indian folk art traditions. But, you know, she also says, well, having spent so much time, obviously, living in England and being influenced by European sources as well, which I don't think has been really explored in the same way, but I feel as though she was very much taking from both.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you know, I think she says in her interview that she can't help but be influenced by it because she's, you know, she's obviously from here. She's kind of living and working in here. So I don't think any of us can say that we're not being influenced by that kind of European knowledge that surrounds us and has an expectation. I mean, to the point of where you want to eschew it at some point, you know, you kind of, because it's actually, you know, so present in a way that kind of digging up something else from somewhere else is quite important. But I think Bhajan is quite right. The colours are really, to me, they absolutely are earthy. They're kind of from the space of the land, which is absolutely fantastic. But there's something also, you know, where she has incredible life forms and there's movement there, but there's also always this kind of connection to death. For me, there's a slight rendering of danger or threat in a way that is evoked, and I think it might be to do with colours. It might be to do with the trees being completely nuded in a way. So I think this life cycle that she works with is a really interesting and fascinating kind of aspect in her work, which I think is obviously from Hindu religion, culture in a way, but you know, it's more than that for her. And I think there's such an incredible strength to, I mean, that's why I was drawn to her in a way, because we were doing this exhibition called Womanness, which was really only looking at women of colour, and you know, she has the strength of her paintings really absolutely places the woman in the centre of it, and has always done. So she doesn't do work unless that's the case, which is absolutely amazing. You know, it's a consistent thing of self-portraiture and a feminist kind of narrative, and that is really to be valued.
Well, there was an exhibition that caught my attention in 1992, Myth, Dream and Fable, which included Gurminder, and I think there were 5 other artists in that exhibition, including Paula Rago and Eileen Cooper, and that was at Angel Row in Nottingham. But it suggests that, you know, her work is being understood better at that point, and that curators are trying to position her more carefully. But, you know, going back to this idea of collectivity, where did feminism come into that? And did you feel as though there was a subsection where Gurminder was potentially, you know, or not?
There's always a subsection, isn't there? There was a lot of discussion about, I think one of the things with Autograph, for example, was, you know, that we had an incredible mix of people, but believe you me, there was discussions around gender issues in quite substantial way, and that continues to play out. So, you know, as usual, we know that that's not different. So there is a way that, for me, Gurminder's consistency was really important. But yes, I mean, when we were working collectively, there was tension but agreement that was being made, and I think women, you know, if I think about people like Monica Baker and myself, and, you know, in relation to Amit and Rotimi Fanicode and Sunil, there was that kind of, in Autograph, there was a very real way in which we were absolutely clear on trying to acknowledge issues of gender, issues of race in more equitable ways as we kind of founded those spaces. So I think that happened in quite a lot of cases, but it also was not without its tensions. Because the wider establishment still was favouring certain, ways. And I think that's changed quite substantially now, which is really great.
Should we take some questions? Or comments?
I know Hamad has probably got one. I can tell. Yeah.
Just briefly, say that I was part of the Asian Artist Group. So in a sense, how Roshini and Bhajan elaborated about Gurminder's activity and work. I think importantly, when you talk about autograph, you were, I think, based in the Midlands, and autograph was primarily in London. So importantly, what we have to understand is that this was post-riot, post-uprising times we're talking about. And this whole notion about black art or black artists, and we're talking about a certain generation here, which might be regarded as critical decade, the 80s primarily. So why did people get together, individuals, or why was the notion of Asian Artist Group important? These are conversations. Remember, I was in Nottingham, I came from Birmingham. These cities, urban areas, were affected by riots and uprisings against Margaret Thatcher. And importantly, with Gurminder and Sardo, the necessity to actually have conversations among us with Asian background. We are from different religion. We don't have Christian names. We don't have Christian faith. I was with Keith Piper and Donald Rodney in the art college, and they have Christian names. They came, and their elaboration on slavery, the whole black narrative, the Atlantic narrative, was prominent. I was the only one Southall who was born in Africa. Southall wasn't a trend. So in a sense, these are very complex conversations. And Eddie Chambers used to come to Nottingham. So quite interesting how Eddie Chambers, being an artist and a curator, puts Gurminder's work as part of black art, plotting the course exhibition. And the notion of black art then and black art today is different. Of course, it's generational issues, or whatever. So why did we get together? It is primarily about this post-riot, post-uprisings. And a lot of people, it was about justice, equality, all sorts of issues that black people were affected. Black meaning people from Asian, African, Caribbean. This is about racism.
Arabic.
And the other thing that's important, it might not come across, this lovely exhibition. It's really nice to see the exhibition, and really big respect to people who contributed to this exhibition in the gallery today, is the notions of collectives. And we did a lot of work in community centres. There was not many commercial, hardly any commercial galleries. Midland group that you talked about was partly an Arts Council funded space, like Ardna Feeney in Bristol. There was access, but largely there wasn't access to those spaces. And a lot of us were working with communities. Dan knows from Nottingham, we were at one of old artist studio groups, like Space or Acme in London. And there was a lot of activity there. But there was like Indian Community Centre, there was Caribbean Centre, but with us, we worked with Project Bhajan, and Roshini might remember, and Sumi lecturer came to work in Nottingham on a couple of workshops. So there was a lot of work with the community, women, community, workshops, talks, which was not about educated art audience, talking about working and having a dialogue with the community and learning from each other. And I think that is really important for my understanding, my upbringing, my education, and for the Asian Artist Group. By the way, Asian Artist Group, Ag means flame and fire in Hindi. So,
Nice.
So I just wanted to kind of elaborate.
That's great.
I had a couple of comments and then a question. And the comments are, firstly, thank you for everybody bringing these works together, because I haven't seen this work or so much of it. And secondly, for laying out some of the context. And I think if just as perhaps to add to the complexity, because some of the things that we've been mentioning, so things like Cartwright Hall, and we talked about, and it's quite often talked about the time of Nimmer,
Yes.
Smith, and in the 90s when the work was being collected. But actually, Cartwright Hall was collecting artists of Asian, African, Caribbean background well before. Decades before.
Yeah.
So they did this as a political imperative. So, sort of now dead white guys who were collecting this because they wanted to reflect the city's population. So they felt that the city art gallery needed to be in dialogue with the city's residents. So they commissioned Sousa's work in the 50s. They collected Shamsa, Audrey Williams in the 70s, Vanessa Zed in the 70s. So people that, Tate eventually 40 years later started collecting. So I just wanted to make point, that there's a lot going on which is around a locality of politics, and that the fact that these arts councils were trying to reflect that and play that back. And that fed lots of artists, people like Li Wanjia, by the Northern Arts Group, which was similar to the Midlands Arts Group that you described. I think the second point I just wanted to make was also, and I think there is rightly being sort of critique around the other story, around representation. But I think we also have to think about that the other story took more than 10 years in the making. And the other story was coming from a place of addressing modernism and the story of modernism.
That's right.
And by the time it actually took place, there was like, oh God, it's been 10 years, so we need to add some bits more. But it was never about reflecting the sort of the 80s practice. It just happened to be at that time and was then critiqued for that. But it was really about this idea of people who had come to this country wanting to take part in an international model. And now that when we go back and look at those things, and we've had lots of debates because I was also part of the Black Artists and Modernism project, and robust debates were had within that, to say actually we're doing a particular kind of violence to go back and start classifying people like Shamsa with this label, because that's not what they had come here for. This is a very different experience of a very different generation, of a different political time. Artists like Audrey Williams and Shamsa, or Sousa, they were there to be part of the international model.
Can I just respond? There's two things that come to mind in response to that. One is that I think what was interesting is that we didn't know that things like that were existing in places like Cartwright Hall. So there's something that was happening with a lack of visibility of those particular artists in those spaces. So I think that was something that was quite interesting, and in terms of our own education, we had little knowledge of where those collections of artists of colour were in England. And that's to do with profiling, and it's to do with, the way in which the galleries respond to and put on shows, etc. Right? So, and I think that's changed. And the other thing is for me, I don't know about other people, perhaps could say otherwise, the other story was a London narrative, right? It was without any doubt at all. So we were outside of that, and we were looking on from the different areas and thinking, well, somehow we're not necessarily being included as much as we should be. And there was so the other story narrative for me is not as central or as important in that kind of debate. But anyway, I'm just kind of responding to you.
One question I wanted to ask, and that came from the references about plotting the course. So my familiarity with plotting the course came because of a work made by Helen Callock as part of the commission for the British Art Show. Because she grew up in Wolverhampton. Yeah. So for her, it was this crucial exhibition that in a way shaped her, let's call it visual imagination, sufficiently so that 30 years later or 25 years later, she's making a work which references that. And I wanted to ask you whether you are familiar with artists of a different generation with knowledge of and interaction with Gurminder's work.
No. No, not that I'm aware of, no.
But perhaps that goes back to the point you were making around, yes, the work was there, but who was seeing it and how was it being encountered?
I think that, there's something quite fragmented about, how another generation of artists of colour are getting knowledge about the work in circulation. It's a real issue. They don't necessarily know about the what's gone on before. That's not being taught in the universities as we would like. So there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of doing that.
I think in terms of what comes to mind, Gurminder Sikand, she came from Nottingham. She's an artist who's actually showing at the John Hanson Gallery at the moment. It was part of British Art Show many years ago, but it's very interesting intergen. So Gurminder, from what I remember many years ago, that she was aware from Sardul Gill, an artist based in Nottingham and worked with us, was teaching in a FE college, or Whitechapel Foundation in Art and Design. A very important, really interesting foundation course in Nottingham, West Bridgeford. And Gurminder was a student, and he must have kind of come across, she must have come across Gurminder's work in terms of a couple of shows we've had. But I take your point, it's very interesting, that cross-generational or intergenerational dialogue as well today, and then quite interesting, especially with Gurminder Sikand's work.
You have a question?
Yeah, and very oddly, last week I was just reading about the collecting, names collected at Cartwright Hall. What's interesting is I'm interested in lenses going back today and what we must have been like in those moments, which is very different, I feel, to the lens going back to it today.
Yes.
And I feel and what's really interesting with that, very odd coincidence that I'm at this talk and I happen to be reading this essay, I know. And it's the kind of wider cultural production that was thought about. So it wasn't just about visual arts.
That's
and it's questioning other forms of collecting and material culture as well. And I think today, if we pull back, like this is where we're moving within the visual arts now. So I think there's a lot we can learn and yet to uncover in these moments that were happening, probably through struggle, lack of money. I did a project with John Lyons a year ago, so before the Whitworth show at Kettle's Yard, and he was telling me about his space in Hebden Bridge, and having artists come and international artists come and stay in Hebden Bridge, and or in Manchester where he's working. So I think we're in a really interesting and I think maybe slightly problematic moment in that everyone has this lens looking in, but how do we really talk about that moment within the context of which it actually did happen, and then how do we take lessons from that? And I suppose that's what I've been thinking about as everything's beginning to open up a little bit more, and you're getting to see amazing work which is left hidden for years. Anyway, it's not really a question, but
it's a very valid comment, though. I mean, I'm just all for intergenerational exhibitions. I just think we can't be isolating and historicizing particular moments of history that actually do not speak to a present generation, and that's the danger I think that's happening at the moment. So there's the Tate show that's coming up around critical decades. It's going to be only looking at that decade. The Women in Revolt one has done the same thing. So there's a way that this is not really facilitating or helping to mobilize transformation and knowledge from one generation to another, and I just think that absolutely needs to happen. And it's also about giving next generation resources, right? They have to be acknowledged and recognized as emerging artists in their own right, in a way that's actually in dialogue with what went on before. And it's just not happening. I don't see it.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a student, I think it was really important that that was through Indian Artists UK. I met up with people like Balraj Khanna, Amal Ghosh, Ibrahim Bagh, and even Maria Souza, who at that time ran the Gallery 38. And so those were, we stood on their strengths because they were the first generation who came and who started getting together, and they ultimately became the Horizon Gallery. So there were those strengths, and they were getting together, and they were really important for people like myself and Syed as well, who showed at the Horizon Gallery. We all had one-person shows there around that time, and it was an amazing space, So I think, you absolutely cannot ignore that. And I remember then we had people like Sutapa or other younger artists who used to write to us to say, we're doing our dissertation and can we have information about what you're doing? So I think you are always generous with sharing your ideas and talking about those connections. You cannot ignore them. And Nilofer might have something to say about that as well, I think, because Nilofer showed in Transition of Riches.
Yeah.
I thought it was a very interesting period, and as has already been remarked, we didn't quite know what was happening, and we became part of all collectives. I mean, I've been part of another collective in Southeast Asia, and all collectives have complications and difficulties which either brings them together or tears them apart very badly. And as Bhajan has pointed out already, we were looking to show, because we were, as far as the dominant culture was concerned, we were the other. We had no space, we didn't have a voice. I mean, going to art school was fine, everybody worked, at the same level apparently. But once we came out, you were isolated. So I think it was important this sort of stuff happened. And then we got to meet each other also that way. It's, again, you're talking about not knowing what's happening, like in the Midlands, there was isolated pockets going on here, there, and the other. I don't know if they ever came together, and the other story I felt was very, you just remarked about it, and you remarked about it, that it had been happening for 10, I didn't know that, 10 years before, prior to its presentation. And the other thing that happened, very important thing that happened, was the collectiveness of the women artists. They were getting together, they were showing each other. I think that was very, very important. And I mean, just now they had this show at the Tate. I was appalled how, again, the Western artists were separated from the black artists, right at the back of the whatever, they're slotted there. Whereas we were also many times part of these people, the white artists. It's not that we were so separated. So there were all these kind of distinctions being made, unnecessary distinctions, in my opinion, which could have been a healthier conversation. So that's another thing.
And I think the studio groups were really important, because around that time I had a studio at Open Hand Studios in Reading, and I was with lot of white women artists. So I think we were struggling, we were together with lots of different kinds of groups. We weren't like separate from the rest, we were doing things in whatever capacity. And also I think things changed in the 90s, where, like Syed says, we had those interactions with the community. There was a very rich Bhangra scene, there were the melas happening, and media, there were interesting programs like Naya Jeevan Nayi Zindagi, and they were, presented by Channel 4. And so I think there were things happening in lots of different areas of the arts generally. And there was the Asian Women Writers Group, so people were coming together in lots of different ways, and it's hard somehow, just to slot it separately. It was a much more, I think there were a lot of layers happening. As we said, there were the galaxies rather than just little stars system as such.
Do we have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about her medium. And was watercolour the only medium she used, and how central was it to her work?
I think Nathaniel, you might be the right person here.
So the works on display here are all generally gouache watercolour, but later in her career in the final decade or so, she turned more to drawing. So that was a change of medium.
Okay, and it wasn't the material didn't necessarily relate to the subject matter?
I don't think so in the sense that women trees were sort of consistent subject matters, so that stayed the same even when the medium she was using changed when she turned to drawings. I think women trees and gender equality, those themes and subject matters remain central.
And just as one other point, but just somebody that, because you've got this catalogue here, and actually there are some contemporary artists whose work I know, but it was really interesting that they were put in dialogue with Gurminder's work. It was like a
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, so I mean that's a good show.
So showing Cambridge, the goddess of deity.
Yes. And also things like transforming the crown, the work that was done in New York. I mean, that was an incredible set of essays produced, and work. The gamut, the range of work was quite extraordinary. So there are some moments of really, really interesting kind of mixtures of artists and critics who are writing in a substantial way. And it would be really interesting to kind of revisit those in more depth in a way, and to have that in dialogue with younger artists, emerging artists in a way, because those conversations and some of those essays analysing and looking at the work are really, really significant at the time, which kind of goes back to your point. But I think just the other thing that I think is really fractured at the moment and again was slightly easier for us was the ability to have kind of spaces, community spaces or spaces to meet. We haven't, the real estate has become an issue, right? So there's a privatization that occurs and so for me there's something quite interesting about, this kind of space of being able to turn it over to the possibility of conversation and discussion and progression, It's a really interesting way in which that is absolutely vital, and particularly in somewhere like London as well.